Okay. You can hear me? Okay, good. So I want to share some reflections on the 1918 influenza pandemic and faith healing in Africa, responding to Alan's encouragement about how we, as historians, can recover historically the meanings of disease. I'm interested in the social history of disease. I'm also a trained theologian, so I figured that I would bring both together in my reflections. What I find striking about this pandemic of influenza in 1918 is how it would lead to the rise of what we call anti-medicine movements across the continent of Africa. The timing and the context of influenza, I think, are instructive. It comes at a time when colonial and missionary medicine were on the ascendancy and making rather triumphalist claims based on things like the rollback, malaria, yaws, sleeping sickness. Flu in 1918 was unresponsive to biomedicine, and the result was that it precipitated a cognitive crisis for Africans who were trying to deal with the claims of biomedicine and its capacity to bring about cure or healing, and also dealing with the intricacies of their new faith as Christians, as we were talking about primarily first-generation Christians in Southern Africa, in East Africa, in West Africa. African perceptions of the war and what had caused influenza are striking. So we see for the first time 1918 and the war, drawing very extensively on the recruitment of African soldiers. This was the time when taxation was imposed to aid the war effort. It was also a period that Africans were directed towards cash crop cultivation, as distinct from food crops, to aid the war effort. When the war ended and influenza came back with demobilized African servicemen, there was a sense in which people saw the flu pandemic, especially in the fact that it attacked often young adults and its unresponsiveness to medicine, as something connected to the imperial war that they had fought or just fought, connected to industrial capitalism and the demands it made on them, and connected to their new faith and the wrath of God. Southern Africa, West Africa, in East Africa, the response of many Africans was to gather at churches where they believed healing would come as a sight or as a gate to heaven. When Dean Williams mentioned the closure of schools and theaters and saloons in Boston, one key site was left out, which was the closure of churches. And for many Africans across the continent, it looked like the colonial government was closing the very site, the very place that was most in need at this time in 1918. What this would lead to would be the rise of movements that trace their history exactly to 1918. In Africa, we kind of see 1918 as the equivalent of 1907 in Azusa. For many church traditions, like that of the Aladura movement, 1918 is when the Holy Spirit descended in Africa. And I want to point to just three quick observations, because this is a story for me that is rife with paradox. Africans demanded spiritual healing during the influenza pandemic. It's a disease that appeared suddenly, struck epidemics, and often, as in the nature of pandemics, it retreats before everyone really gathers their resources together. The colonial government was wise by saying that we must close all places of gathering and prevent large gatherings of people, especially the church. The challenge was that this was a period where we see faith healing becoming important actually in the Church of England from the 19th century through the 1960s. Exorcism, the laying on of hands, the practice of unction. African Christians actually were attracted to these signs of healing. The challenge for missionaries who believed that Africans were a particularly superstitious people was that they were unwilling to connect Christian healing, which is seen as the continuing work of Christ, with African understandings or African requests for healing. In 1918, we see a couple of important churches emerge in Nigeria. One is the Aladura Church. And these were churches that, interestingly, actually began in the Anglican Church as prayer groups. So churches are closed down. African Christians meet in private homes to pray. And it is during these prayer sessions that they begin to give room to both visions and to dreams. And that is how this perception or this idea that faith healing is a therapeutic system in itself, and that should be explored exclusively, rejected indigenous therapies, and biomedicine would become important. John Peel, and I'm going to end, the historian of the Yoruba, an anthropologist, did an important book on the Aladura in 1968. And he points out that this period of 1918 through early 1930s was a period of turmoil. There's the influenza pandemic of 1918. There was bubonic plague in Nigeria and in much of West Africa in 1924 and 1936. Then comes the economic depression, which is a global depression. These were moments and events that seemed to require a religious interpretation. Though circumstances materially improved after 1935, what is striking about this moment is that not only did it give rise to faith healing and an exclusive insistence on faith healing, even though conditions got better after 1935, it left a legacy of faith healing. And in much of West Africa and in other parts of West Africa, faith healing remains a robust and viable therapeutic option. So thank you.